I sometimes wonder if, were I to go back to the interview that granted me a place to study for a master's in psychotherapy 20 years ago, whether the outcome would have been the same had I informed them at the time that I was, and have been ever since, in some way or another, a card-carrying misanthrope. Andrew Gibson opens his book on the subject by declaring that misanthropy is a somewhat impossible position since it rests on a, quote, fundamental contradiction. The misanthrope hates human beings, but is themselves a human being, therefore their stance must culminate in a profound self-hatred, something that Gibson regards as inherently absurd when framed in this way. Perhaps this is because Gibson writes like a man who has never experienced aversive emotions towards himself, as if no part of his psyche were capable of feeling revulsion, disgust, or outright loathing towards another part of himself or towards others. Ooh, not you though, you get tea. If we're all somewhat misanthropic, at least in certain shades or circumstances, or have, aggressive misanthropic parts that step in to manage, patrol, or put out inner fires, is it worth perhaps asking, what kind of misanthrope am I? Are you? After all, not every misanthrope is cut from the same threadbare cloth, I've discovered in the last 2 decades, listening to and, reading from others in my tribe. The first real attempt, as you may know, if you've clicked on this video, to pin down misanthropic types, comes from Immanuel Kant, writing in the late 18th century, when I suppose misanthrope was still, a bit of a almost theatrical insult, not necessarily a diagnosis. And Kant narrows down misanthropy to 2 varieties. You've got your enemy of mankind, what he calls the positive misanthrope, positive only in the sense of active hostility, sort of panto-villain, Trump-like sociopath, contempt for humanity so complete that it comes with an overt will to harm or undermine, sometimes in the form of direct sabotage, sometimes more cold, calculating, sitting back, just quietly rooting for the catastrophe to happen ASAP, convinced that we all deserve it. Cheers. Then there's the fugitive misanthropist, Kant's negative misanthropist, who responds not with attack but with retreat. If the world is rotten, the smartest move is to stay out of it. And Kant dismisses this stance as contemptible for, walking away from what he calls humanity's dignity. By dignity, he doesn't mean modern day poise, self-respect, but that kind of enlightenment conviction that every human carries inherent moral worth simply by being a rational creature-ish. So through the misanthropic lens, we could say, quaint fantasy, but for Kant, it really was a duty in a kind of grin and bear it Enneagram 1 kind of way. You don't just get to check out just because people are awful. Still, at least he was a little bit less harsh with the fugitive than he was with the enemy of mankind, conceding that some people simply have no taste for other people, which is true. We're called introverts, misanthropic introverts. 250 years later, along comes Ian James Kidd, citing Kant's old paper and taking on the first 2 Kantian misanthropes. Maybe in this case it is Kantian misanthropes, the enemy and the fugitive, but adding 2 more, right? So Kant's division was all about affect. Is your withdrawal powered by hostility or aversion? Kidd keeps these 2, the hateful enemy, the fearful fugitive, but he adds types that are defined less by what we feel and more by how we kind of position ourselves. So you get the activist misanthrope who engages with the world precisely because they think it's a mess, believe it's a mess, trying to, fix it, reform it without ever really liking it. And also the quietist misanthrope who sees the same mess but opts for withdrawal as a kind of principled stillness, not out of fear or hostility necessarily, but because they believe the best thing they can do for the world and themselves is to just step aside. Wise misanthropes, writes David E. Cooper in his book Animals and Misanthropy, are under no illusions. Quote, "It is unlikely that the world and human beings are going to change dramatically for the good, and it is anyway hard to see how you or I could contribute to such a change, even if in some manner it came about." Cooper's book, incidentally, is the single best tome that I've read on misanthropy, maybe because it makes, the case for a kind of grounded, morally justified misanthropy, one built not on bitterness, but on a kind of clear-eyed appraisal of how entrenched our moral failings are, especially towards animals. His answer isn't grand salvation, big causes, but it's the quietest answer. Small, deliberate acts within our reach, undertaken with humility, even a kind of tenderness, without the delusion that the whole species as a whole is ever going to improve. You could argue, I would, that a direct line runs from Freud laying down the Holy Creed in terms of giving us, Moses-like talking therapy. Men and women, this is Freud in Civilization Is Discontents, he writes, are not gentle, friendly creatures wishing for love. They might seem like that on the outside, but no, they have this powerful share of aggressiveness. This is Freud's quote. Powerful share of aggressiveness must be reckoned, must be included as part of our instinctual endowment. Basically, we're vainer and more predatory than we like to think we are. And what do you expect after millions of years of competitive resource-hoarding primate evolution? We've been clawing at each other and clinging to each other for as long as we've been human. Get with the program, says Freud, the Darwinist, blah, blah. Which is why I think the best that therapy can do for us, as Freud admitted famously in his studies on hysteria, is transform hysterical misery into just kind of common unhappiness. And I am pleased to say that I do deliver on that score in a way that I think more than justifies my 4.9 stars on the Google business platform. As work goes, still preferable to what most people have to do out there to keep warm, fed, sheltered. But can, you say, I think, can touchy-feely therapy be done effectively by a misanthrope? Me. I say, well, founding father, great-granddaddy Freud was a profound, indeed unapologetic misanthrope, writing in a letter to Pfister in 1918, that's PFI, not, Pfister. I have found, quote, "I have found little that is good about human beings on the whole," writes Freud. "In my experience, most of them are trash, no matter whether they publicly subscribe to this or that ethical doctrine or to none at all. That is something that you cannot say aloud or perhaps even think," end quote, in letter to Pfister. And yet, of course, the quietist would want to say to Freud's more activist or enemy misanthrope that maybe most of them, Freud, is really all of us. Especially you, Freud, you status-hungry, grudge-nursing, credit-stealing egotist. Although in his favor, Freud did have, I would say, a pretty sensible solution lined up for Palestine as far back as 1930, when he declined to back a petition condemning the 1929 Arab riots. "I do not think," wrote Freud, "that Palestine could ever become a Jewish state, nor that the Christian and Islamic worlds would ever be prepared to have their holy places under Jewish care. It would have seemed more sensible," writes Freud, "to establish a Jewish homeland on a less historically burdened land." Ah, Freud, well done. Imagine Israel being led by Sigismund Shlomo Freud rather than Benjamin Bing Bong Netanyahu. Sometimes the misanthropists of the world do really have the best lines, if not some of the best parking spots. The question, I think, for this misanthropist, at least right now, is, am I going to lose subs on this video by outing myself as a quietist human species hater? Probably. And ironically, or paradoxically, one of those, it is exactly this kind of social rejection that really stings the part of me that still wants to be loved or accepted by my fellow human animals. Although, alas, that part, right, the needy narcissistic part that will twist itself into whatever shape it thinks it needs to in order to be liked, that part has to always eventually stand shoulder to shoulder with the misanthropist, and the misanthropist, thank God, and all of God's minions, almost always gets the final word.
I wonder why you love me, baby. I hardly love myself at all. I think we're both a little crazy. We need some therapy, that's all. I'll see a man, you see a woman. You need a mom, I need a dad.